Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian for the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. Are you one of those consumers who have trouble navigating the grocery store? Like, should I buy organic foods or non-organic foods to improve my health? Do you ever wonder if you're being bullied by specific marketing messages that influence your food decisions or make you feel guilty about what you eat? Organic food sales in the U.S. were at an all-time high in 2022, breaking through $60 billion in total revenue. This demonstrated an annual incremental growth over the last 10 years. On the marketing side, there are over 200,000 misleading marketing messages in a grocery store that can influence your food choices. In this podcast, we speak with Michele Payn, who discusses what separates organic versus non-organic foods, whether or not they provide additional nutritional benefits, how food companies are bullying you and you don't even know it, and how to help yourself and your children overcome these messages. Michele, welcome to the All Me podcast. It's so great to have you. And I know we're talking about a really unique topic today, but thank you so much for being a guest today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be talking about two of my favorite subjects, farm and food.
Excellent. And so we're going to be talking about farm and food. Obviously, we're going to go into some things about organic versus non-organic food bullying. But before we even get into the Q&A of this, let's learn a little bit about your career path. Why did you get into the field of wanting to know everything about farm, food, and agriculture?
It was fairly natural for me. Organic, you could even say. I grew up on a dairy farm, so I have very few memories in my life that do not involve beautiful black and white cows, Holsteins specifically. And those are the type of cattle that many people think that are skinny, but I prefer to think of them as Olympic athletes because they're amazing performers. But my career in agriculture did indeed start on a farm in southern Michigan. I grew up milking cows. I bought my own cattle when I started at age 9 years old, and I'm proud to have passed that on to my own daughter, who's an athlete at the University of Georgia and loves her cows too. So I went from our farm to Michigan State University and earned degrees in agricultural communications as well as animal science with an international relations emphasis. And then went out and, believe it or not, I sold semen, which is probably something you've never had a guest say before, and that was dairy semen to be specifically, but I worked internationally in genetics, and then went back to work for an agriculture education organization known as the National FFA Foundation to give back and develop people's knowledge around farm and food. And through that work, I really found that there was a gap between reality of how food is produced and how food is consumed. And so 22 years ago, I started my business, Cosmeters Corporation. I am a wrangler of words, which means that I speak and I write a whole lot about farm and food. And I've also delved into science communications as well as stress management in the mental health space, specifically for agriculture. So that's a little bit about my career path. I don't know if that's what you were looking for. It certainly is probably unique to many of your guests.
Definitely. I wasn't expecting you to say you actually were selling semen. So
exactly.
That
Think about the airplane conversations as a blue-eyed blonde who's 24 and a half years old. I'll just leave it at that.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it had to be fun growing up on a farm. I mean, I'm a city person. My mom had, she bought a ranch, or, we call it our country place where we had horses and stuff, but we didn't raise cattle. So it had to be really unique growing up on a farm.
Yeah, that's what people tell me. It's just my life. And I will tell you that it amazes me how people will make comments about how farmers and ranchers don't care for our animals. Because the reality is if you're going to milk cattle, if you're a dairy farmer, you have to love it or be crazy because it's 365 days a year. And so the challenge that we have is trying to help people like your listeners understand what really happens on a farm. I don't know if you knew this or not, but only 1.5% of the United States population is on a farm or ranch today.
Wow. That is
and it's really hard to overcome the misinformation. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, and that's why we have you here. Hopefully the information you're going to provide today is going to help our listeners have a much better understanding of what goes on in the life of the farm, but also with our food supply. So that kind of starts my first question. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about organic, non-organic, and really what actually constitutes and what makes these things what they are. So my first question is, how would you define what makes a food considered organic?
Sure. That's pretty easy, actually. USDA, through the Ag Marketing Services, manages the certified organic seal. And there are specific protocol in place that a farmer has to meet in order to have that seal. I would strongly encourage your listeners, if you do choose to buy organic, and I'm not sure that you necessarily need to, but if that is your choice to do so, to always look for that USDA seal. Food that is labeled sustainable, natural, farm raised, or any other type of label that does not have a definition and it does not have a measurement basically is bunk. And there's a lot of bunk on our food labels today. So the USDA organic seal is the one that has all of the requirements, and it is very much about a production choice for the farmers who choose to grow food organically.
Now, for those farmers that are growing organically, do they have to go through a specific type of program for their farm to be considered organic? As what is that process like?
They do. And my friends that farm organically, quite frankly, have told me nightmare stories because the paperwork is very intense. And one of the things that farmers particularly dislike is paperwork, because we like to deal with our land and our animals, not with papers, and probably not with people much of the time either, if we were truthful. So those that are on the animal side actually have to fill out very specific information about how they care for their animals, what their veterinary protocol have, and they basically, on both the crop and the animal side, have to have met organic standards for 3 years before they can earn that certification. So if you can imagine growing, producing, farming organically, your input costs are going to be substantially higher. So if you could imagine going through those higher input costs without having the higher um, profits on the other side, or the higher payment on the other side, it's not only painful from a paperwork side, but it's also painful from a profitability side. And it's not because farmers are corporations or doing anything wrong. It's because we are viable businesses who need to be able to earn money to support our families.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a little bit more work involved in that process for those farmers that want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's talk about the differences of organic versus conventional food. What are those differences when you look at those two types of foods?
So when you look at organic versus conventional, the organic requirement is basically that they won't have any synthetic pesticides used on them. And that does not mean that they don't use pesticides. Both organic and conventional growers, and conventional are those that farm traditionally, use pesticides, because the reality is where food grows, bugs go. That's just, you think about, have you ever grown a tomato?
Yes, we have.
Okay, so you think about the nasty white bugs that
Yep,
happen, aphids, they're disgusting. Or how about the worms? Do you ever pluck the worms off your tomato leaves?
we have. Yeah,
Yeah, so it's gross, right?
it
So
is. Yeah.
imagine a field of 100 acres of those, or 1,000 acres. Imagine trying to deal with the bug factor. And when I say bugs, I don't just mean insects. I also mean molds. There's a lot of fungus that, particularly on the fruit and vegetable side, there's a lot of fungus that are involved. There's actual weeds that are very invasive that can take over feeds and or fields. And many people think that organic farming is more sustainable because of the lack of synthetic pesticides. And I would encourage you to think about the productivity. So if you have a 10-acre field that can produce 100 pounds, and you have a 10-acre field that can produce 125 pounds, which is more efficient?
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, if you can produce 125 pounds on the 10-acre field, that seems to be the most efficient.
Yeah, so that's the challenge with organic is that the productivity values are not at the same level. And I would just really encourage people to look at the differences in the pesticides. For example, historic, this is one that throws a lot of people. BT, which is a bacterium, and I won't try to, it's Bacillus thuringiensis. There, I outscienced someone, I'm sure. But it's BT, and BT is used as an organic pesticide historically. It is also the bacterium that has been used in making BT corn, which is GMO, otherwise more accurately referred to as bioengineered. Um, and so it's fascinating when you look at the science. There's nothing wrong with BT, but it's accepted as an organic pesticide, and yet people don't necessarily always accept bioengineering, BT, or GMO foods.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people just complain about that. And I see a lot about that lately on just social media, how they look at the back of a label of a can, and if it says bioengineered, they're kind of frightened about that. And I don't know enough about the entire process, but it seems like it's not as harmful as what people are making it out to be.
Well, and it's not, and that's a great example of food bullying, actually, because the reality is if you don't understand, you're not going to trust, and what you don't trust, you're more likely to be fearful of. And unfortunately, that's what's happened with misinformation around both food and farming.
Excellent. No, that's great. I'm glad you made that clarification because I've been seeing a lot more of that lately. Now, I've seen some articles and studies claiming the nutrient content of the food is higher in organic foods versus non-organic foods. Is this true? And if so, can you explain this a little more?
It's interesting because it very much depends on the food that you look at, and it depends on the study that you look at. So I'm sure that any number of your listeners could probably cite studies that say, yes, there is a definitive difference in nutritional value of organic food. Well, I could also probably throw down some studies that show you that there isn't. So at the end of the day, this is where I have come down to in writing 3 books. It's a tough topic. And I will tell you that if people choose to buy organic and they can afford to do so, it's a great choice for them. And more importantly, in my book, if a farmer chooses to grow food organic, to produce food organically, that is their choice. And I will 100% support that. However, when I hear about people who live in food insecurity, those who live in food deserts, are consuming fewer, I believe the statistic is 12% fewer vegetables and fruits than what they had previously, largely because they are afraid of hurting their families, of harming their family if they're not feeding them organic produce. So as a dietitian, that creates some massive concerns.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to me, again, I will absolutely support a farmer who chooses to farm organically. Some of my friends shop organically. As a mom, I have never seen science that validates any reason to spend 25 to 35% more at the grocery store, especially in a time when our food inflation costs are crazy. I
Yeah.
don't know how many of you like the inflation that's been happening, but it's painful.
No, I don't love it at all. So and that's why I'm glad you're kind of justifying, hey, we really don't have to shop organic, because my next question was, are there really any additional benefits in consuming organic foods over non-organic foods?
Yeah, I've not seen the science that shows those. Again, it's an individual choice, but to overly simplify it, um, you look at, for example, the dairy case. I'm intimately familiar with milk clearly, and I can tell you that all milk by USDA standards doesn't have antibiotics in it. It's a national requirement. All milk's pasteurized. There are differences in the type of milk that you buy. For example, high protein milk for your fitness audience and for athletes. We buy a lot of Fairlife because my daughter's an endurance athlete, right?
Mhm.
And very valuable, but that has nothing to do with the labels that are on the front. It has to do with the nutritional facts label. And what I would encourage everyone to do when you're purchasing food, to flip it over and look at the nutritional facts label and forget all of the rest. Because, for example, chicken, meat, antibiotics, same as the dairy case, they're not allowed. And so in the labeling, a lot of people go to organic, I know, because they want to avoid residues and they want to avoid antibiotics, and they want to avoid pesticides, and they want to avoid a lot of things. What's fascinating is if you step back into science, we're all comprised of chemicals. Chemicals aren't bad, they just are a part of life. Hormones are also a part of life. So the challenge that we have is when we become less familiar with some of those elements of food, like chemistry and hormones and so forth, it's easy for us to be bullied by a package, peer pressure, social media, manufacturers, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting. Yeah, and that's really interesting to kind of hear because you mentioned the cost component of this, and 35% more, and that was going to kind of be my next question: is what makes organic food more expensive? Is it just more expensive to grow, or the farmer's cost is a little bit higher?
Let's go back to the example where we were talking about 100 versus 125 from a 10-acre field. If you have 125 pounds of a product, let's say tomatoes, produced from that 10 acres, not only is it more sustainable, it's more efficient, it's more cost effective. So the cost of organic produce, organic food rather, is higher because of the time requirements. One, because, for example, you have to weed fields a whole lot more, which requires a whole lot more fuel traditionally. You have to go back in there and disturb the soil a lot more. And so the challenge that you have is that you have more work, you have more paperwork, the input costs are different, and you have less production. So the big reason is that fact that in most cases, organic is a lower production. It's no different than producing widgets, right? If you can produce 100 widgets in an hour, you're going to be more efficient than if you can only produce 75 widgets in an hour.
Right. Well, and I'm glad you also clarified that antibiotic component, because you see that a lot. You see that in the marketing, and as you mentioned, the food bullying, because that is a concern. I see so many people at the grocery just looking at different things, and I don't step in and make any comments. I just listen, and it's really interesting to kind of hear why people
Yeah.
buy certain things, and even from friends who've asked me questions, and I'm like, well, I'm going to be interviewing someone soon about this, so I'll have hopefully more of those answers in here.
Well, and it's interesting and at the same time it's sad.
Right.
Because, I don't want to go off all high and mighty here, but we have the world's safest food supply. And we have phenomenal systems in place to protect that safety. And the fact that people are so concerned about some of the nuances, the fact of the matter is that we are protected from chemical residues because the requirements that are put in place are so far under what humans can tolerate that there's really very little risk. And I know there's been a lot of fear put out there, especially, for example, about girls developing earlier. And I get that as a mom, about glyphosate and all of the Roundup trials and so forth. I mean, we have a heightened sensitivity to many of these issues. But the challenge that we also have is that we have people who can't afford our food today. Eggs, for example, on the food bullying podcast, when we first started that podcast a few years ago, we interviewed a woman who had she was formerly homeless, and she had a 1.5-year-old son at the time. And she talked about how eggs were a basic staple. And so maybe that 20 cents a dozen increase that you've seen doesn't hurt you, but think about an egg as a basic protein building block.
Mm-hmm.
For a child. It's essential. And so the increases that we have seen from some of this misinformation and disinformation, it not only hurts farmers, but quite frankly, it's really a disservice to consumers, particularly those who can't afford the nutrition that they need for their family.
It's a great point. Yeah, and we don't typically think about that when we look at certain people that are struggling financially, because maybe their wages aren't going up. But as you mentioned, food costs is going up 20, 30, 40%. That's going to make it very difficult. And so thanks for clarifying that information. Now, when we look at, you mentioned synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and you said really it doesn't seem like these are going to really, because my question was, are there any particular risk? But it seems that you mentioned these are so low in the process of making and producing organic and even conventional foods, there's very little harm in consuming those, I assume.
Correct, which is contrary to what you will read in most of the food books. But if you're really into this, I would encourage you to go to EPA and take a look at what some of the requirements are. I actually had an interesting experience with a friend recently, a mom of a couple of boys, three-season athletes, and she had had dinner with a person who owned a ironically, I think it was an organic fertilizer company, and she was shocked at how long it took to get a product to market.
Hmm.
And that's because of the research. I mean, I know traditionally it took at least 5 years and I think around $20 million. And that's probably dated information at this point. So the research that is required for a product to be used in any arena in producing food is significant. And there's also the very cold reality of farms are businesses. And while we obviously want to care for our land and our animals first, farms are businesses. And I can tell you that I'm not giving my cattle antibiotics unless my veterinarian tells me that I should be doing it, and if it's cost effective to do so. So the same is true with pesticides. We're not going to go out there and spend $1,000 on pesticides if we don't need to.
Yeah,
Um,
and I'm wondering too if these same people that are concerned about pesticides are they consuming fast food and processed foods and foods that have very little nutritional value. Should I think we probably should be more focused on reducing those from the diet and increasing produce and dairy and certain products that have a high nutrient.
Yes, and I'm not going to bully anybody about those choices, but I would tend to agree. And the reality is here in the United States, we're hypocrites. We like to think we're going to do the right thing, but when we go to the grocery store, it's pretty clearly shown that we don't always necessarily adhere to what we want to do.
Right.
Um, and so that, I look at food from a very different perspective than most people, and I get extremely frustrated when I go into the grocery store. Truth be told, I do mostly everything through apps and online now because I don't have to look at food labels that way.
Right. That's a great
And I
point.
can just look at the nutritional facts label. But the challenge that we have is we spend so much time consumed about what's wrong with food. Rarely do we take the time to celebrate what's right with food. And as you said, nutrient value is huge, and clearly we probably need to do a better job of that in the States.
So let's talk about that kind of moves into our next topic. You wrote a book called Food Bullying: How to Avoid the BS. This book seems to be focused on how marketing labels and misinformation is used to bully and demonize people around eating choices. So my first question, can you explain a little bit more about how you see people being bullied with misinformation?
Sure. Well, let me just ask you this. When you go to the grocery store and you see people examining their food, is it typically with confusion and guilt, or was it with joy and thrill?
Yeah, I don't know if you see someone like going, "Wow, look at the nutrition facts on this," right? It's
Right?
not like they're real excited about it, but it's yeah,
Yes, so it's sad because in my research, which was not any university research, but in my research and writing each of my three books, I have found that people are largely confused about food. And as a result, particularly moms often feel guilty. They feel guilty that they didn't choose the right thing, that they can't afford the right thing, that they maybe made a mistake, that they didn't read the label right, that they're not keeping up with the Joneses, et cetera, et cetera. I know some moms that will only take snacks to preschool if they are from a certain store with a certain label. And I think that's really sad, honestly. So, food bullying takes a look at the now more than $6 trillion food business. And what I wanted to do is, I knew after I wrote my second book, which was Food Truths from Farm to Table, that people were confused about food, and much of that confusion came from labels and about the misinformation that they had through marketing. So, as I had mentioned earlier, basically the food bullying cycle starts when you have a disconnect. So, if you haven't been on a farm or ranch, what studies show 75% of people pre pandemic hadn't been on a farm or ranch in 5 years. So if you haven't been on a farm or ranch, you've not talked to a farmer or rancher to know how food is grown, you're going to have this disconnect. And that's normal and that's natural. I know as a parent, when I am not familiar with a particular subject or a person, I'm disconnected from it and I'm not particularly interested in allowing my kids to be anywhere near it. So with that disconnect comes distrust. And this distrust, I think you can particularly look at COVID, and not that we need to have any conversations about vaccines or anything, but there's a lot of distrust. And to me, there's a tremendous amount of distrust in science. And as a dietitian, I would imagine you would support the statement that if we can't lead the food discussion with science, we're going to lose.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I,
100%. There's
yeah,
too much
data and
pseudoscience.
science. Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I love to make emotional decisions and drink red wine and eat chocolate, but I also know there's consequences to that, right?
Correct. Yeah.
There, there's also consequences to mandating that chickens have to be raised a certain way, because it does raise food prices, and science doesn't necessarily support that. So, without going too far down the tangent, the distrust is really kind of the second step in the food bullying cycle. And then with that comes fear. Clearly, we all know we don't, or that, excuse me, clearly, we all know that we fear what we don't trust, what we're not connected to. That's been proven over and over in the last 5 years. And in the food arena, it is proven daily in the grocery store. And the bullies, and I don't want to point any particular fingers because I think we're all guilty. Farmers, dietitians, food processors, retailers, manufacturers, marketers alike. But there are certain elements, just so you know, when you're in the grocery store, there has been a lot done to keep you in that grocery store as long as you possibly can. And so the challenge is knowing where some of those things are so that you're not fearing them, because with the fear comes the bullying of a label being supposedly more green, a label claiming natural, a label claiming uh, antibiotic free, when in fact every other product can make the same claim in the meat case or the dairy case. So the reality is that bullies are preying on that fear. And if you think about a playground, it's not that much different than a playground, because you've got one group of people in one area and another group of kids in another area, and the bully comes along and makes everyone scared. And that's more or less what's happened in the food playground.
Yeah, I get frustrated when I see certain things on foods, not really related to the farming and growing aspect, but more about if it's a bread that's low carb, they can put keto on it, or if it's a certain food that might be a little bit lower in sugar, but it's loaded with processed oils and things like that, where not that you consume it once. It's I don't like to look at things as good or bad. It's food, like you said, it's either has a nutritional value or it doesn't,
Yeah.
and we can consume all of these things and still do have a good quality of life. It's just some of these things frustrate me, and I'm like, oh, it's really not keto food, but I get why they get to put that on the label.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. And one of the things that I did in food bullying is I went through hundreds of pages of documentations from USDA and FDA, defining food labels. And I, as you can tell, get a little bit distraught about the labels like clean and even local, because there is no definition of what local food is. Non-GMO is a paid to play. If you're not aware of that, companies pay to have that label put on so that you buy more food. All natural is another one. There's no measurement for that. And I'm sure you love the cleansing label too as a dietitian, right? Isn't that one of your favorites?
This food's
But
clean. I'm like, did you wash it? Like, what are they talking about?
well, and that's what farm raised. I could probably go on for 20 minutes about why that label is completely useless, because name a food that hasn't been farm raised. But anyhow, so the labels that count are those that have specific measurements. For example, sugar-free is required to have less than half a gram of sugar per serving. The same is for fat-free, except for it's a gram, or excuse me, half a gram of fat. Low sodium is another one. Those are measurable. The heart check certification is actually a very viable label that if you have those concerns, I am not a dietitian to be clear, but those are measurable. They are meaningful, and so is the whole grain stamp. And I would encourage you If you have concern about carbs, please talk to a dietitian because there is so much misinformation out there about carbs, and there's nothing wrong with grains. Your body needs them. And by the way, if you weren't aware, I've had veterinarians tell me that people are damaging their pets because they're trying to feed their dogs grain-free diets. And there's actually a problem with pets when you do that. So uh, there are some labels that are absolutely useful, but the vast majority of them, if they're not measurable, they're not meaningful.
Excellent. Now, one of the things I find concerning is your concerns about people that when they have about what others think about their food choices. I see people posting
Yes.
about pictures of food and, just perception about I don't want to eat in public because of certain things. How common is this for people to have that type of fear?
I think it's probably very common. I'm not seeing the statistics on it. So there's a number of disordered eating. And because I'm not a dietitian, but my books have directly been, my books have directly served a number of dietitians to try to connect the nutrition world and the agriculture world. I've become familiar, but when I wrote Food Bullying, I was dumbfounded by the people that reached out to me who had experienced eating disorders or disordered eating that very much went back to the paranoia around food, whether it was fat, whether it was caloric intake, whether it was the obsession with food, which is a very real stigma, the keeping up with the Joneses mentality, the social media mentality. I mean, I love to post pictures of food too. I'm an absolute foodie. I also happen to be a good cook. So I enjoy showing off some of the products. My daughter's very into cake decorating, and we've built 5-tier cakes together. So I believe very much in the joy of food and sharing that joy of food. But when it becomes a judgment and when it becomes a manipulation to serve your interests, it's a little bit concerning. Food at the end of the day, I very much believe should be about celebration. It should be about getting your family together, and it should be about nourishing your family.
I love that. Yeah, there is a lot of people pushy. I mean, my mom was like that growing up, or even today. They want you to eat certain things. I've heard about that through clients about just being scared to eat around family because they feel like they have to eat more, and if they're not eating enough, people get a little concerned that they might be trying to diet or So I can understand with holiday eating that had to be stressful for so many people being around family.
Hmm.
When it comes to food choices.
Hmm. Well, and food's a very personal choice, and you likely eat differently than me. And I think it's like many things in our society, we have to be okay with our differences.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you mentioned there's over 200,000 misleading marketing messages in the grocery store. What are just a few of the most common marketing strategies used to misinform the consumer?
Well, and the way I came up with that number was very selective. If you figure that there's about 40,000 products in a grocery store, which is statistically relevant, and that is accurate, by the way, I estimated 5 claims per product. So that's the 200,000. There is no way your brain can sort through 200,000 claims. I don't care how smart you are. The challenge is to try to figure out what makes sense to you. So one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is neuromarketing. So marketing that directly targets your brain. One of the ways that the food marketers do this, and this was actually documented in Psychology Today, and I've covered in Food Bullying, is called effective conditioning. So you put sunshine on a baby food jar and you add some nice labels about how it's natural and how it's this and how it's that. And you have positive association because of the sunshine and associating that baby food with really good feelings. Because, of course, what parent today does not want their baby to have sunshine and happy baby food that's going to make them super smart? So you see how the effective conditioning can work. And there's other ways that your brain is being targeted. And some of the marketing that goes on around food, I just would ask that you step back and think, A, is it true? And B, what makes this food truly superior to the next one? And I will be honest with you, based on the research that I have found in all my years of doing this, I pretty much stick to store brand unless the taste is poor, with as few claims as possible, because of all of this misinformation that's going on the label.
Yeah, and what I've learned too with a lot of the store brands, even to some of the private label, even some of the name brands, the nutritional value and the nutritional facts panel is really no different. It's pretty much identical. I've looked at, and I won't say store names, but I've looked at a couple of the grocery stores where we live in Louisiana, and some of the store brands are excellent when it comes to that compared to the actual name brands that could be 40, 50, 60 cents per can more, depending
Oh,
on.
absolutely. And just so you know, they're often bottled or canned in the same place.
I figured it's probably like that. I've done a lot of work in the dietary supplement space, so you can just wrap your label around something that they already have the formula for on the shelf, and it's like, boom, private label. So I figured it was pretty similar in the food, but I wasn't sure if that was the case.
Yeah,
Now,
it's interesting.
when we look at labels, what are some of the labels that you see that maybe can cause some guilt and confusion in the grocery store? You may have addressed some of this, but are there any specific types that you've seen that really can kind of confuse a customer, or is it just going back to using 5 different common, marketing strategies or 5 misleading messages on those products?
Well, I think the fairy tale of the free labels, GMO free, hormone free, antibiotic free, pesticide free. So, first off, there is no food that you're purchasing that is hormone free, with the exception of salt. And the reality is that hormones are required by life. Hormones are the chemical messengers of life. We all have them. You have hormones, I have hormones, your maple syrup has hormones. And hormones aren't necessarily bad. And we're all built out of 6 basic chemicals, and so is your food. And chemicals aren't necessarily bad either. And then the antibiotic free, I think we've already talked about. The GMO free, as I had mentioned previously, is a paid to play label. And that's why they actually started requiring the BE or bioengineered label, because there's only a dozen types of food that are technically bioengineered that are available for human consumption. So I think a lot of the claims start there, but then when you look at ethically raised, that is one that I will tell you as a person who will go out tomorrow morning and break the ice in our cattle's water to ensure that they have enough water and give them extra hay because it's going to be cold, and make sure they have enough shelter to be out of the wind. I find extremely offensive, because my question always comes back to, how is your food more ethical than my food? You choose to pay 25% more for a certain label, fine. You choose to shop at a grocery store that charges 30% more because they have that brand. That's fine. But at the end of the day, when we have people hungry, and my very strong opinion, we're not doing our jobs when we talk about ethical food. And so the righteousness that comes about all of this. And if you're into psychology, I actually use my Maslow's hierarchy of needs to talk about food bullying and how people try to fulfill some of their self-esteem and other needs rather than looking at basic building blocks of nutrition and safety in food.
Excellent. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to kind of learn that. Now I want to kind of discuss a few things on how we can help maybe people overcome food bullying. I'm thinking a lot of consumers out there don't even realize they're being bullied. They just look at labels and go, "Oh, wow, I'm going to buy it because of that." But for those that might be feeling guilty about food choices, maybe trying to buy certain things, are there any steps in your book or just things that you would recommend to help them kind of overcome some of these things that they're seeing?
Yes, so the first thing that I would do is to suggest that you turn to firsthand experience. I mean, just as if you're a fitness person, you're not going to work with someone who doesn't have expertise. For example, when my daughter was still in high school and we were trying to get her to move to that next level of competition, we went to a trainer who specialized in distance runners. He doesn't specialize in gymnasts, he specialized in distance runners because he has that firsthand experience. So the same is true in food. If you want to know how your food is produced, I can assure you that there are farmers out there that are happy to explain to you. So knowing the source is absolutely critical. And then also knowing the science. And I realize that not everybody's into science. I happen to be married to a person who informs me that on an almost daily basis that he doesn't really care what the science of his food is, even though his wife wants to tell him all about that. And knowing that science involves turning to dietitians, I would hope that most of your listeners would know that you need to have someone with expertise in nutrition, which is specifically trained. And that's not necessarily your doctor. It's certainly not probably your gym nutritionist. It's an RDN with a degree and the expertise in that. And no, I was not paid to say that. I believe it very firmly. And then the third piece is a little bit more complicated, but it's knowing the system. So, do you know the agriculture and food and regulatory system well enough that you can identify the roles of USDA, FDA, EPA, FSIS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that are actually regulating your food? So on a very base level, those are the things that I recommend is to know the source, know the science, and know the system. Then as far as the bullying goes, is to know where your own standards are. Um, and those standards can be very different for different people. And so knowing where your ethical standards are, knowing where your environmental standards are, knowing where your social standards are, and knowing exactly where you are willing to put a line in the sand. I put a very firm line in the sand when I go to the grocery store that I will not pay more for a food that has a certain label on it. If a food has more nourishment, for example, for my daughter, she needs a lot of protein, clearly. I will pay more for more protein. If the food has a better taste, or if it's a treat, I will pay more for it. But that's because I know exactly where my standards are. And I think that if you're going to spend a lot of time talking about food, it's really important for you to know where your standards are as well.
Excellent. Now, last topic, Michelle, I want to kind of dive into is really talking about marketing for kids, because we know there's a lot of products out there that are just focused on that youth population. My daughter's 12. She's kind of becoming a lot more cognizant of just food and using it as fuel as a volleyball player. But how do you see the food industry marketing to kids? And are there any concerns for this population?
Well, I think the overall concern that I have is the marketing that's done to all ages. And clearly, I mean, you can walk through the grocery store and you can see the cartoons on food and you know who they're targeting. But with Generation Alpha, Generation Z has shown some of this, but with Generation Alpha, they have very clear standards of what they're willing to accept and what they're not. And Generation Alpha has more of an opportunity to influence their parents' food choices in the grocery store than what any baby boomer parent ever allowed. And I can say that because I had baby boomer parents. And so what I prefer to do is to step back and think about what is happening to our brains around food. Because without getting into too much science, there was actually a neuroscientist that right before I released food bullying, released his studies on what was happening as far as how our brains are being manipulated around food. And it very clearly showed through fMRI that our brains will light up around certain foods, and it can be taste, it can be information, and such. And the brain is fascinating if you look at it. I mean, we all know that if you're a parent of an athlete, that your athlete's mental strength is equally as important, if not more so, than their physical strength. So much of athletics is a mental game. The reality is so much of a food is a mental game. Most of the time, we buy food based on emotion and what our friend Kelly said, and we don't necessarily buy it on nourishment. And so, what the study basically showed us how the brain processed information around different modern food production technologies. And those were sustainability, hormones, antibiotics, and animal welfare. And so it's fascinating to me to look at a bare science level, the fact that our brains, no matter what our age is being manipulated.
Interesting. Now, I kind of want to just dive back into youth a little bit, just because I've been around parents and kids that are just stressed about food, and mom and dad, I work primarily with athletes. They're like, I can't change my kids' eating habits. They don't want to listen to me. And that's pretty typical. My 12-year-old doesn't want to listen to us very
Mhm.
often either. But are there any steps parents can take to help their children have a positive relationship with food and maybe not feel demonized about eating certain food types?
Oh, sure. Well, easy one is, as a dietitian, I'm sure you recommend this, is to get them involved in food choices early and often and continue to offer the different types of food. Some people are born to be more picky eaters, but I have witnessed any number of examples of the more often you can have your kids involved in the kitchen and the garden and offering different food choices, the more likely they are to be engaged. I had no idea that I was creating a gourmet foodie cake decorator. I'm just not that smart. And my daughter's grown, but she still very much subscribes to the experiences that she had in raising food. And, I haven't touched on one subject, and it's sensitive for sure, but I do want to talk a little bit about those of us who raise animals. And whether you are vegan, flexitarian, or carnivore, it doesn't really matter. But to me, what matters is that you all understand that we work really hard to care for our animals, and that is an absolute privilege to do so. And at the end of the day, their purpose is to provide us for food. So even our dairy cattle, if you can imagine, as a mom of, trying to think, I think she was 12 when my daughter's first dairy cow had to be shipped, meaning that she was going to be turned into a hamburger. That's not easy. And it's not easy whether you've been through it 100 times. It's not easy if it's your first time. But at the end of the day, my daughter will say it's their purpose. They're serving their purpose, and we have to be okay with that. And so I do think it's interesting the perspectives that we bring into our children's food story for life based on what they experienced in childhood. So I would just encourage you all to make sure that kids appreciate their food, that they look at it as a point of celebration, not condemnation. And the reality is your 6-year-old is going to be vastly different when he or she is 26. And you're doing the best that you can, and that's okay.
Excellent. I love that. Yeah. And that is an interesting comparison when you look at your child and what the purpose of the cow is, right? You would never think of that. It's like, oh, wow, this is what I'm eating. And you develop a relationship with that cow, you take care of that animal. And then one day that becomes food, as part of the food supply to help, fuel somebody's body and improve their quality of life. So that's a really interesting way to put that. I would have never thought of that.
Yeah, it's something that unfortunately, I think with anthropomorphism, which is the humanization of animals, which is very prevalent in our society, it's really a challenge for people to understand how we can kill farm animals. But I take great pride in being able to provide protein for people.
Love it. Now, last question on this, and we'll kind of close out with one more question. We've talked about this earlier, and you may do the same. I don't like to put food in categories of healthy or unhealthy, good or bad. It's, they have nutritional value and some do not. What are your thoughts around how people should view food? If you had to give them a couple of just key points, what would be your recommendation here?
How people should view food?
Just view food overall.
Oh, yeah, that I would love to talk about. First off, please view food with gratitude. If you've ever lived a day in your life without enough food, which I've not, I won't claim firsthand experience on that, but I've worked a lot in developing countries. Most of us in agriculture feel deeply passionate about feeding the world. And I would hope that the first thing that you do at every meal is to be grateful for that food being there to nourish your body and to strengthen your body. And then the second one, I'll reiterate the celebration. Food has to be about celebration, not condemnation. I mean, it's required for us to live. And if you're an athlete, it's required for you to perform. And we all know you're not going to perform if you don't eat well. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a piece of chocolate, but it does mean that you do have to have enough knowledge around nutrition. So to me, it's all about equipping yourself with the right people and the right professions around you so that you can get the truth in food, so that you're not bullied about it, and so that it really is about celebration and gratitude.
Excellent. I love it. And the last question, Michelle, for you today is there anything we didn't cover that you feel our listeners should know about?
I would just encourage all of your listeners that if you have questions about food, please talk to a farmer or rancher, and you are welcome to reach out to me at Payn Speaker on social media, and I will try my best to connect you with people. And likewise, make sure that you're getting your nutrition information directly from registered dietitians.
Where can we find more information? What's a good website for you?
Yeah, so causematters.com is my website. At Payn Speaker, I'm on Insta, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter/X. And the 3 books that I have that you can find at causematters.com are Food Bullying, Food Truths from Farm to Table, and No More Food Fights.
We're going to have all of those in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. Pick up one of Michelle's books or all 3 of those books. I'm excited. I want to read. One of my goals this year is to read your food bullying book so I can learn a little bit more about this. I know we talked about some of it, but there's going to be a lot more information because I want to share that with my family. I think sometimes I try to not hover over everything my daughter does. We try to lead by example, allow her to prepare. She's taking a home ec class at school, and she's really getting more interested in talking to me about carbohydrates and protein and how to fuel her body. So I was like, all right, she's learning from others, but she doesn't want that from mom or dad. So, which is fine.
Get it.
Yep, I get it, and I totally get it. But I want to learn more about that. So thank you so much for all of the wonderful information you provide today. We're not done. We're going to do what's called our curveball round. This is where I'm going to ask you a couple of different questions about some questions that have nothing to do with today's topic. You ready?
Uh-oh, maybe I need more coffee. Yep,
right,
go ahead.
First question is my always staple question I ask every guest. I'm a music junkie. I love music. I probably would have loved to be in music more than anything else. But if you could be the singer of any band, whether it's today, the past, who would that be?
Oh my goodness, seriously? I'm pop culture illiterate. So I will answer it twofold. I love Whitney Houston and Celine because of the purity of their voices and their passion that they portray.
Their vocal range is absolutely insane.
It is, yeah.
What would today's Michelle go back and tell young Michelle? There's something you can give your young self advice about. What would that be?
Oh, there are so many things. I would probably say to loosen up and realize your career isn't going to be exactly what you think it's going to be. You know, I started selling bull semen and embryos internationally. And as funny as that sounds, that was the singular thing I wanted to do when I graduated from college. And there were 3 companies I would have worked for. So that was a little limiting. And, you know, I look down the road and I've spent almost a quarter century speaking and writing now. And I'm working on a 4th book called Science Story Speak. I would have never projected that ever. And so when I work with young people today, I always try to make sure they understand their career path is not linear. Their life is not going to be what they think it's going to be. And sometimes you just have to embrace the craziness.
Love it. Last question. What's something unique about you that very few people know about?
Oh, so the one that I always tell people is that I love to drive a bobcat. And I don't mean the animal, I mean the piece of equipment. And even my farm friends don't quite understand this. So a bobcat is kind of like a skid steer, and I grew up cleaning barns in one, and I just find them highly entertaining. So I really love just moving dirt with one. I don't get to do it very often, but that's kind of a unique thing, I suppose.
Very cool. Very cool. Love it. Michelle, great information. Thank you so much time. Thank you so much for taking the time today to spend with us and share more about your wisdom about this important topic. I know this is going to go a long way, and hopefully more people will come to your site and purchase some of your books. Thank you so much. It was an honor to have you on the All Me podcast.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Happy New Year to everyone.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.